Hi, just another quick video tonight. This one's about how Freemasons target women to marry them in order to make them lose their salvation. And this story begins back in the early 60s. My father and mother had both attended Indiana State, and he had a college degree in accounting that he got from, the GI Bill. And so they got married, and they thought they were going to have a wonderful life together. And when I was and I'm sure it started before I was in kindergarten, but that's when it got really bad. My father couldn't figure out why, but he kept getting fired from every job he had. He worked for Burger Chef Corporation. That was like back in 1962 or 3, and they were a competitor for McDonald's, and they let him go, and he could just never figure it out. But now I realize they were the Freemasons in Indiana that were shutting him out of work. Indiana, and this I heard from a Freemason, has the highest percentage of Freemasons of any state in the country. And you wonder why Steven Spielberg named his movie Indiana Jones. The best I can figure out is it's some sort of tip-of-the-hat nod to all the Freemasons in Indiana who have wreaked so much havoc on so many lives. My second stepfather, his best friend, was a man by the name of Bill Hayes. And Bill Hayes told me himself that he was attending Bohemia Grove. Now that was back, I can't remember if that was in the late 80s he told me that, or in the early 90s. But at the time I didn't know what that meant. I simply thought it was a bunch of rich old men with too much money playing at summer camp. It was bragged to me that all the elites were there, and I think it was Isaac Stern, some violinist, very famous violinist, who played the violin at one of the meetings, and of course he made it sound totally innocuous and of no result. Anyway, his father, Bill Hayes' father, was Will Hayes, who was president of the Motion Picture and Directors Association back in the 1930s. And if you read anything about Will Hayes, he was a piece of work. He had his hands in everything, and he was a major player in the Teapot Dome scandal, though he never got charged. And what I find interesting about back in the 1930s and 40s, if you read any books on Hollywood, they talk about the Hayes office and how he was ostensibly in charge of censorship and making sure that things didn't get too racy in the movies. And he was a crypto Jew, I know that, even though it has down in one part of thing that his father was a Presbyterian minister. And if you read the book that I suggested, when Scotland was Jewish, apparently Presbyterianism is like, I don't know what it has to do with Judaism, I just know it has something to do with Judaism. But anyway, and a lot of these pastors, Freemasons and Shriners, are in pastors to make the churches apostate. So anyway, back to my story. My father kept getting fired from jobs. And of course, within a couple of years, my mother thought he was a bum. Why can't you keep a job? And that's when my first Freemasonic father stepped into the picture. His name was Rhiman, spelled R-H-I-M-A-N, Alfred Rotz, R-O-T-Z. And he was a boss had something to do with the company. My mother was working for DA Lubricant at the time, and that's a fishy company in and of itself, because both my stepfathers were involved in that company. So, what's that tell you? And anyway, she met him while working there, and they started up an affair, and she walked out on us when I was in first grade, and that was in 1963. And went to shack up with him. And my mother, up into, she was brought up, my father was a godly man. Now, we know that my whole family are crypto-Jew Illuminati, but my grandparents and my mother, at least, were God-fearing people. albeit they could be lukewarm, but they were still God-fearing people. Went to church every Sunday. My grandpa read his Bible. My mother clearly didn't. So anyway, Mr. Rotz was brought in to woo my mother, which he successfully did, and she divorced my father. The divorce was final in early of 1964, and I was living with, my sister and me were living with my grandparents at the time, and I was 7 years old, and suddenly I remember being hustled up to Indianapolis from southern Indiana to attend my mother's wedding, which of course I really don't remember. But anyway, back to Mr. Rotz. He had inherited from his father, John Rotz, an engineering company, a mechanical engineering company. And he was quite successful. So going from a father who can not keep a job to a stepfather that not only has a job but owns his own company, it was a step from, lower middle class to upper middle class. And he took us to live in Speedway, Indiana. And Speedway, Indiana, at least in the 60s, I doubt it's changed too much now, was this pretty much, now that I've done the research, it was a controlled Freemasonic community. Back then, I venture to say you couldn't live in Speedway, Indiana unless you were a Freemason member, because I've since discovered everybody I knew there, their fathers were Freemasons. And most of the men in Speedway worked at one of the Allison division plants, for General Motors. And I don't know what all they do, but I know it's, engines and car design and whatnot. Mr. Rotz, his hobby, he was president of the Rules Committee for what was then called the United States Auto Club. It was called USAC, and it was like a precursor to, it was mostly Indy cars, but I think at the time they did sprint cars and stock cars and everything else. And because he was very wealthy, and there again, to be a race car driver, you have to be a Freemason. And they took YouTube, after having been up for 9 years, YouTube took the sound away from that fabulous video about Indianapolis, and it exposed the Indy 500. And the Indy 500 is a totally Freemasonic event with the checkered flag, the 33 drivers, and all of that. So when my mother married Mr. Rotz unwittingly, in addition to our family, but now we had Freemason, Freemason in the family in the guise of this stepfather. And if only 2 or 3 years ago anybody had told me that Mr. Rotz wanted to harm my family, I would never have believed him. In fact, I would have probably thrown you a right hook if I could, because I really thought that he loved us. I do remember lots of laughter. He could be a very stern man, but it would never have occurred to me that he had intended harm to my family. And I remember vividly a picture of him that it sat on his office desk, and it was of him in his Shriner outfit and with the big red fez hat and the crescent moon and the scimitar sword. And when I was doing research on Freemasonry, and I learned the meaning of those hats, that the Shriner hats are that dark burgundy red due to the fact that they were dipped into the blood of the Christians in a massacre that took place 500 years ago or so. To say it was like having the wind punched out of me is an understatement. And I do know his name has something also to do with Freemasonry. And there is a character in the Bible, Rhiman, A-H-I-M-A-N. And see, his middle initial was A, but his first name was R-H-I-M-A-N. And that has something to do with, I just remember coming across something that has something to do with Freemasonry. I don't know if it's geometry or whatever. But I remember asking my step-grandma Rotz when I was about 8 years old, because I'd never heard of that name, Rhiman, and I said, "Did you name him after rye bread?" And she laughed, and she said, "No, I made it up." But I now know she was an Eastern Star. and everything. But back to my story, I did see a bit, I know of one instance where I saw some Freemasonic magic from him. It's the only instance I remember now. There could be more that I'll remember later, but I've trudged my brain. And this happened back when I was like 9 years old, and I was playing in the backyard. We had an English bulldog, and I was playing out in the backyard with him, and I was just kicking a ball around. And the reason I was kicking the ball around was I'd already been bit twice by that dog and had to go to the emergency room because he was quick to snap. And so I wasn't going to, you know, put myself at risk for getting bit. So I'm kicking the ball around in the backyard, and we had a big picture window in the den that overlooked the backyard. And I remember looking up, and I saw Mr. Rotz, Rhiman, and my mother, and my grandfather standing at the picture window watching me kick the ball. And suddenly, before I knew it, my mother was flying out the door and came over to me and started beating me around the face. And I was like, what are you doing? You know, just unprovoked. And she said to me, I saw what you did to that dog. And I was like, what are you even talking about? And anyway, she tried to accuse me of touching the dog in a strange manner. And you have to remember, like I said, I was like 9 years old. And I just thought she was wacko because my hands hadn't even been below my waist. I mean, it was so strange. And do you know, I never forgot that incident. And about the time that I learned the Freemasons, that it's all Kabbalah magic, that's when I had my big aha moment. And it was like, oh my word. And I don't know how they do it. I guess they put a thought in your head. I mean, I don't know anything about it. I really don't want to know anything about it. I just know it exists. But that whole incident, he had made my mother see something that hadn't happened. Now, I just remember my grandfather, when I came into the house and she was yelling at me to go up to my room, I remember my grandfather standing there bewildered. Now, I don't know if Mr. Rotz put the spell on him as well, or if it was only my mother. And I don't remember any other instances, but I know that was Kabbalah magic. Him making her see something that hadn't happened. And I do know that I know of other people. Now I know that other people who were targeted by Freemasons for marriage. One guy was a really nice guy. I'm going to go into more detail on that in another video. But he died in 2011 at the age of 61. And I just know a lot of people. I have like a list of it's like 30 people that, unbeknownst to them, were affiliated with some kind of occult person. They didn't know it, or a Freemason, Eastern Star, whatever. And their lives were ruined. And my sister, now she's 3 years younger than me. She won't speak to me. I figured out that her husband, her whole marriage was a setup, that her husband is a Freemason. And there too, I don't know if, I'm sure he's put spells on her. She won't speak to me, but she's throwing away her salvation because she's got so much hate for me that's, really for no reason. And she might have even willingly joined them. I do not know. I'm guessing that she hasn't, and I think she's looking for answers, and she's not finding any because she's surrounded by these people, and they're just filling her head with, idiocy. Because you look around today, you just watch the Grammy Awards, and they're doing all this satanic stuff, and, all these false flag things, and she lives in Connecticut. So, I don't know. I just pray for her a lot. But I wanted to make this video about what these Freemasons, they want you to lose your salvation. And this was the first stepfather. And his son, whatever this is worth, Rhiman Rotz had a son, Rhiman Jr., and you'll find him if you look on the internet. He was a professor at Indiana University up in the Extension in Gary. And he always seemed like a nice guy, but there again, you know, it's not like I hadn't even seen him in 30 years. We had talked on the phone. But what was interesting about him, when he and I started to reconnect in the early 2000s, suddenly he told me, he said, well, I can't email so much anymore. I've you know, I'm a professor, I've got students. And so I backed off and I thought, oh, I understood. But and in reality, he had stomach cancer. And he died at the age, I believe he was 58. And he died something like September 28th of 2001. So just so you know, Rhiman Rotz was his father. He wasn't my stepfather. And what's also interesting is that his wife Brenda, after he died, and a lot of these marriages that you see today, they're all Freemasonic with Eastern Stars and stuff, if they're not with somebody that's been targeted. And his widow, boy, she hooked up with somebody immediately and got remarried. And 3 years after Rhiman Jr. died, she died of breast cancer. And I'm going to do another video on that about the big die-off of people. I've been following the obituaries for a long time now, for like 30 plus years. And I've never seen a die-off like we're having now. Like one family I know, they had 4 kids. None of them even made it to 60. They all died in either their late 40s or 50s. And they were Freemasons. But anyway, back to Rhiman Rotz. Had anybody ever told me that Rhiman Rotz never had my best interest at heart, I wouldn't have believed him. I would have thought they were insane. And that's how good these people, their facade is, that you really think that they care about you, and all they want is your destruction, and you're totally clueless. So let that be a word to the wise. If you're in a relationship where your wife or husband doesn't want anything to do with the Lord, and you do, I don't know what to tell you to do about that, but just be aware that this person may not be who you thought they were. And I'm sure at my mother's judgment, and she's going to say to God, well, why can't I go to heaven? You know, I went to church every Sunday and gave 10% and this and that. And he's going to say to her, well, if you were such a good Christian woman, why did you end up married to 2 Satanists? You know, both my first and second stepfathers. My mother had no clue in her entire life that either of these men were Satanists. That's how good they were. And, you know, what a shock that'll be, huh? So, just a word for the wise, and if anybody has any questions or comments for me, I'm happy to answer them. But just please be aware. And if you're a young person today and somebody comes into your life and, well, he's so wonderful, but he's not saved, he doesn't believe in Jesus, you are to have nothing further to do with that person. If they don't want to come to Jesus or God, please do not get into a relationship where you are unequally yoked, because it will be horrible your whole life and you'll never really know why in many cases. Alrighty, that's all I have to say about that. Thank you very much.